Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Bird Undead or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by the avid reader _ sometimes writer, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Angela.
Bird Undead, Chapter 8, The Flight Out. Abigail does her best to keep her eyes open, sitting up as straight as she can in the chair, but she feels herself keep nodding off until a hand on her shoulder rouses her. She blinks blearily, looking up the hand's arm to its owner's face. She recognizes the features of her sergeant, and then her back is ramrod straight. Her body suddenly very aware that her companion is not within arm's reach of it, like she usually is when Abigail wakes up and the chair squeaks its protest against the floor at the jolt of motion. Her senses abruptly sharpen to alertness as her eyes instantly start to search for Riel in an erratic sort of panic. A rustle of cloth and a blur of movement out of the corner of her left eye snaps her attention over to the bunk she's sitting beside, and it feels like she can't breathe until wild brown eyes lock with almost frantic winter blue. The fixer is sitting up in the bunk and seems just as distressed as her taller counterpart. They both exhale and start to relax again after looking the other over and finding them safe and not far away. Farther than either prefers, but not as far as they'd both seem to irrationally fear. Abigail blinks and swallows quickly, bringing her attention back to the older witch, who still has a hand on her shoulder. "Sorry, Sergeant. What are the orders?" She manages to get out and keep her voice level, her hands balling against the fabric of her strike pants in her lap. "We're being recalled back to Fort Salem effective immediately. General Lamar's team will be remaining for the rest of the week until their investigation is complete. The fixers cleared you, so are wheels up on your mark," Anacostia answers, ignoring her reaction after being woken up, and it's then that the blaster notices the lack of IVs in both of them. The small pinpricks in the needle's wake are covered with a small round civilian band-aid that almost blends in with their different skin tones. "I'm ready when you are, Bellwether," Riel calls softly, pulling a slightly too big strike jacket back around herself again and looking ready to rise back to her feet. "Can we eat something on the transport?" Abigail wonders, keeping her focus on the older witch. "Yes, I can make that happen. It is a long flight, and you two both need the sustenance," the sergeant easily nods. "Can it not be MREs?" the smaller witch requests hopefully. A smart idea, one her taller counterpart hadn't thought of. "Being at Fort Salem has clearly spoiled you, caller, but yes, I can make that happen too." Anacostia chuckles, sounding almost amused but nods again. Her relief at their mostly safe return is clear now that it's just the three of them. The normally formal woman's posture is less rigid. Her eyes are a few shades softer, and she's more open to letting some of her emotions bleed through into her tone. It's odd, but it makes the sergeant seem more human, maybe. More like she might almost care about them, but that's a ridiculous idea. She's seen more cadets come through basic training at Fort Salem than almost anyone, except maybe General Alder herself. No point in getting attached or having favorites when you're not likely to see most of them again after they finish basic. "Then let's go home," the blaster decides with a nod, pushing herself out of the chair and reattaching the sword to her back with her belt. She hands the dagger off to Rael, as promised, when her companion moves around the bed to stand at her side. The blonde examines it for a few seconds before securing it to her hip under her belt and in one of the belt loops. The older witch decides not to say anything, and the pair follow quietly behind her as Anacostia leads them out of the infirmary. Their sergeant takes them through a different building that looks like a barracks space, stopping by the shower area and looking at them both expectantly. "This your way of telling us we stink, Sergeant?" The fixer jokes tiredly, getting a surprising half-smile from Anacostia in response. "You do? You've been out in the wilderness for how many days, Private?" "But this is more my way of telling you that you both look like hell. The two of you have had a long week. I don't know what's happened to you yet, but take this moment to get cleaned up and center yourself while it's here. It'll help. Trust me. Everything you'll need is in the stalls, and towels and fresh clothes to change into are on the benches." She offers instead, a sad sort of understanding in her eyes as she nods towards the door to the shower stalls. It makes Abigail wonder just how many times the older witch has had to wash off the worst of a bad mission before stepping back out to face the next one without flinching. Or worse, how many times she hasn't had the luxury of doing so before the next threat came knocking. As a bellwether, she knows the havoc of what they do can wreak and understands Anacostia's offer for the mercy it was, no matter how small it might end up being. You have to take the moments for yourself where you can. They aren't guaranteed. Nothing ever is. Not today, not tomorrow, not even the next breath you take. The world can change in the blink of an eye, in the space of 2 heartbeats. Abigail knows it, and she knows Rael does too. They've both felt the keen sting of those changes like razor wire, had to face and do their best to embrace them, to learn that fighting it only hurts more in the long run. In one breath, Rael's mom was suddenly gone. The light she'd done her best to bring her daughter in. Her letters and sparse leaves, now nothing but the lingering wisps of smoke from an extinguished flame. In another breath, Charvel was taken. Stolen and brutalized in a place that should have been safe, where it should have been impossible for anything but happiness to have taken place. The birth of a union, made into the loss of such a vibrant life. In one heartbeat, Scylla was the blonde's light, her new start at happiness. In another, she was gone, and their fixer's world was upended again, shattered and twisted, and full of more ghosts than was fair for someone so young and guilty of nothing other than wanting to love and be loved. In a third heartbeat, the Necker was alive again, and in a fourth, she was a traitor. She'd been the enemy, and she'd lied and hurt Rael in a way much more complex than just a heartbreak. There'd been little time to breathe before the blonde's world had gone up in smoke again, before the dust could even finish settling after the last time. In a blink, Liba was Abigail's enemy. She always had been. It was the way of the world as either of them had known it. In another blink, their whole insult had become comfortable, and in the next they felt almost like banter. None of the words were new, even if the undertones within them were. Their verbal spars began to feel more and more like a way to check in on their counterpart without either side compromising, especially after their wedding, and even more so during City Drop. It was the only way they knew how to communicate. She had blinked that day, and suddenly they were something like allies, working together like they had when either would throw a punch at someone who didn't believe them the first or second time they said no. Another blink and they were almost friends in that last ride, and that would always be something which haunted her, what could have been. And then she'd woken up to a world where she was the last witch standing in their lifelong rivalry, and it didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like she had won at all. Their quarrel had never really been something to win at, not alone. Those 2 losses both remaining members of the Bellwether unit had endured felt like mirrors. Rael's mom was a hero, her guide, her light. Charvel was more of a teacher than Petra had ever been. She was the closest thing Abigail had been given to a blood sister within her family. She was the one the younger Bellwether had looked up to and wanted to be like, not her mother. War hadn't seemed to make Charvel lose any of her softness, nor her smile, and she'd fought her fair share of it thus far. Scylla had brought Rael's smile back, made her want to dream again, even if only partially. She'd given the blonde a new grounding point to her build from in the wake of her mother. Liba had been Abigail's eternal opponent and perpetual antagonist, but she had been a steady presence in the taller witch's world for basically her entire life. Libba had been more of a grounding point for her than she had realized until the girl was gone. She had been the one to make the blaster strive for more, both within herself and in the world around them. The loss of a parent, of a mentor, the loss of a steady place to stand through the storms, and the loss of a sister, of one of their own. Tally. They had both lost Tally in the same breath, and it feels like it's only now just starting to hit them. Tally, who was everything good and kind, and curious and selfless. Tally, who only wanted to be one of the good guys, to help people and protect the innocent. Neither of them had ever met someone quite like Tally Craven. A ball of sunshine and unbridled happiness, wrapped up in pale skin, auburn hair, and the curse of being the one gifted to always find the truth, even if it was painful and dark. Tally was a knower, and she was going to be a gifted one. Should have been. But in an instant, their sister had surrendered her future by sacrificing those years of her life to save the life of another. The life of a witch, a life beyond her time. A witch who Abigail sometimes wondered even remembers what it's like to be human, or even a sliver of how human Tally was. Had been. Their sister could be just as headstrong and stubborn as either of them in her own way, and there was nothing in the world that could stop Tally Craven from doing what she thought was right. It was a sacrifice Abigail finds she understands surprisingly well. After all, isn't that basically what she'd done for Rael? But whereas Tally got to continue living through her decision, Abigail had almost not. She'd known it, deep, deep down, as soon as she'd seen that sword tip gleam in the sun. Had only confirmed it when she'd felt the damage it caused to the blonde's chest. She'd known they weren't getting out of there. The fixer wasn't, and the blaster wasn't going to either, even if she'd broken the link like she'd been back to. No. Some part of her might have survived that day if she'd run back to the bed and taken off with it, but she'd have lost 2 sisters in the span of 10 minutes, and the best parts of herself with them. After she fought so hard to get back to them, to keep them both by her side and within her sight where they belonged, where they had all belonged, together. She wouldn't have been able to go on, not alone, not like that. Bellwether name be damned. She would have been dead one way or another. The first way was just quicker and allegedly more honorable than the second. It had made her understand Rael much better in that moment of realization. She'd understood both of her sisters with such clarity then. Tally for leaving them to save Alder, and Rael for the demon she carries. The sting of pain makes Abigail hiss as the needles of hot water burn against the papercut-like slice in her back and the long-forgotten quarter stab in her chest. Rael is going to kill her if she finds it before it's healed. The sharp discomfort forces her out of her thoughts and back into her body that's been moving on autopilot. Her hair is as clean as she feels she can get it right now, and at the very least it's scent-free, and her skin is clear of the rest of the dust, sweat, and dirt that she'd accumulated on her trek. She winces at the water on her chest wound and is quick to exit, dry off, and redress in a strike uniform just a few shades more desert blending in color than her old one. Abigail does feel better as she refastens her sword and belt while she pads back out to wait by the sergeant, surprised to be the first one done. Rael is only 2 minutes behind her, and Anacostia gives them both an approving nod before turning and continuing to lead them further through, until they reach the back of the base, to find a waiting convoy of 4 transport trucks. She herds them into the second one, and knocks on the window to the cab to let the witches inside know they were all set. There's a 2-minute pause where nothing happens, but then the truck rumbles and lurches to life, causing the third and fourth to do the same. The convoy exits the base in a block formation, and the drive to the airfield takes about as long as the initial ride back to the base had taken. The trucks rumble to a stop on a dusty tarmac, and leave them as close to the ramp of the transport plane with Anacostia and 6 other witches before taking off again. One of the other witches hands the sergeant her gear bag before heading up into the transport with the others following after her. We're going to be airborne for about 17 hours and we'll be making 2 stops for around 30 minutes maximum each to refuel. That makes it probably 18 hours from here to Boston if all goes well. First stop is in a private airfield in Bulgaria in 5.5 hours once we take off. Stop 2 is in Greenland, 5 hours after that, and then from there it's only 5 more hours until we're close enough to make the 20-minute drive back to base. The older witch briefs them as they enter the bay last, and the doors close behind them. Here, Sergeant, another one of the 6 witches comes over to hand Anacostia 2 packages wrapped in tin foil. Thank you, Corporal Loftly. These are for you two. Get comfortable. Takeoff will be any minute. The sergeant thanks her before handing the items off to each of the younger witches. Abigail watches as she moves deeper into the cargo bay before heading towards the line of netted seats against the wall to her right and sitting right next to one of the internal structural struts of the belly. Rael follows and drops to sit in the seat on her other side. They strap in to wait as the plane takes off and the cabin pressurizes around them, making Abigail have to open and close her mouth a few times once they've reached their stable elevation to get their ears to pop. The tin foil contains sandwiches that are still warm, and both girls make quick work of the meal, feeling better for it. Double Esther yawns while she crumples up her tinfoil, taking the crinkled up ball of tinfoil from Rael after they're both finished and tucking it into the outer leg pocket on the left thigh of her strike pants to be thrown out later. She unbuckles her belt and carefully sews it and the sword beneath the seat, making sure it won't slide around during the next landing. She yawns again when she sits back up and shifts her position so she can rest her head more comfortably back against the red netting behind her. Mostly dry blonde hair tickles her face, while her body settles against her shoulder and side as the smaller witch starts to drift back towards sleep now that things have calmed down again. Told you I'd get us out of here, the taller witch mumbles tiredly, getting a breathy ghost of a chuckle and the hand finding its way into one of her own on her lap in answer. Abigail allows her eyes to fall closed, reassured by the warm weight at her right. She easily filters out the general sounds and quiet talking of their fellow passengers from further up the bay, and lets herself try to rest while they can.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.